The dining room glowed with the light from a crystal chandelier. Plates of sizzling steaks were passed around the polished mahogany table, and laughter filled the air, a sound that felt like it was happening in another room. My husband Ryan sat to my right, cutting into his meal. His mother, Vivian, presided over the table, her smile as sharp and cold as the crystal glasses she drank from. My place setting was different. The fork and knife were there. The starched linen napkin was folded into a perfect swan, but my plate was empty. There was no steak, no side of roasted potatoes, just the white porcelain circle, just silence. Vivian's eyes met mine. Her smile widened. "I only ordered for family," she said, her voice clear and carrying across the table. My husband continued to chew. I leaned toward him, my voice a small, tight whisper that burned my throat. "Am I family or not, Ryan?" He didn't look at me. He kept his eyes on his plate. "Don't do this," he muttered. "Not here, but I did. It was the only thing left to do. My name is Nova, and I'm 32 years old. I've been married to Ryan for 6 years, which is long enough to learn that a person can be two different people at once. There's the person you fall in love with, and then there's the person they become when their family is in the room. I spent 6 years trying to believe the first person was the real one. It was a long, painful lesson. Before I tell you how everything flipped, like and subscribe and drop a comment to let me know where you're watching from. It all started at a wedding. It feels like a cliche, but it's the truth. The air in the reception barn was thick with the smell of summer grass and champagne. I was feeling awkward, seated at a table of my friend's distant cousins when he approached. He wasn't loud or flashy. He was the quiet one by the bar, the one with kind eyes who seemed to be observing everyone else. When he walked over and asked if the seat next to me was taken, his voice was gentle. His name was Ryan. We talked for hours, and it was the easiest conversation I'd ever had. He asked about my job at the library, and instead of his eyes glazing over like most people's did, he seemed genuinely interested. He asked what I was reading, what my favorite part of the job was. He listened with a focused stillness that made me feel utterly captivating. I found myself telling him things I rarely shared, about growing up in a quiet house with quiet parents, about my dream of one day writing a children's book. He made my small, simple life feel important. In return, he told me about his world, a world of high-pressure finance at his father's firm. He spoke of his family with a reverence that I, at the time, found deeply touching. He described his mother, Vivian, as the family's commander-in-chief, a woman of impeccable taste and high standards. He described his father, Tom, as a tough but fair man who had built an empire from nothing. He made them sound like characters from a novel, powerful, impressive, a family to be admired. He asked me to dance, and when I confessed I was clumsy, he smiled and said, "Good, me too. We can be clumsy together." On the dance floor, he held me in a way that felt both secure and gentle. For a woman who had spent most of her life feeling like she was on the outside looking in, being held like that felt like coming home. Our first few months were a blur of happiness. He was everything I thought I wanted. He was romantic in small, perfect ways. He'd leave a single flower on my car windshield for me to find after work. He learned that I hated doing dishes and would always, without my asking, have the kitchen clean when I got home. He remembered tiny details from our conversations. The name of my childhood pet, my favorite kind of tea, the fact that I loved old black and white movies. He made me feel seen, heard, and cherished in a way I had never experienced. I remember one night, about 3 months in, I was sick with a terrible flu. I was miserable, curled up on my sofa, feeling utterly alone. Around 10 p.m., my doorbell rang. It was Ryan, standing in the rain, holding a bag with a container of soup, a box of tissues, and my favorite flavor of ice cream. He hadn't called. He had just shown up. "I was worried about you," was all he said. He came in, made me eat, and sat with me while I fell asleep watching an old movie. In that moment, I wasn't just falling in love. I was convinced he was my person. He was the one who would show up in the rain. His proposal came a year after we met. It was perfect. A quiet, snowy evening on a bridge overlooking the city lights. He got down on one knee and told me that meeting me had changed his life, that I made him a better person. I cried and said yes without a single doubt in my mind. I believed in us. I believed our love was the foundation for a beautiful life. We found a small house in a quiet neighborhood, the kind with big oak trees and front porches. It needed work, but we were excited to make it our own. We spent weekends painting walls, sanding floors, and building a life together, brick by brick. Those were the good days. We'd be covered in paint, laughing, ordering pizza, and eating it on the floor because we hadn't bought a table yet. In that house with him, I felt safe. I felt like we were a team, a fortress of two against the world. There were signs, of course. There are always signs, but when you're in love, you call them other things. I saw his intense need for his parents' approval, but I called it family loyalty. I saw his deep-seated fear of confrontation, but I called it a gentle nature. I remember once, early on, we were supposed to meet my parents for lunch. An hour before we were meant to leave, Vivian called him. Her voice was a faint, demanding buzz through the phone. She needed him to come over and look at her computer. It was acting up. It wasn't an emergency. It was a whim. "Ryan, we're supposed to be meeting my parents," I reminded him gently. "Can't it wait?" He looked genuinely distressed, torn. "I know, but you don't understand. If I say no, she'll be upset for a week. It's just easier this way. I'll be quick, I promise." He wasn't quick. He was 2 hours late for the lunch with my parents, who had waited patiently. He was apologetic, but I could see the truth. His mother's passing mood was more important than a commitment to my family. I let it go. I told myself it was a one-time thing, but it wasn't. It was the blueprint for our entire marriage. I just didn't know it yet. I was too busy being in love with the man who showed up in the rain, never realizing he was also the man who would leave me standing in it if his mother called. The first time I went to his parents' house for dinner was the first time I felt the solid ground of our relationship crack beneath my feet. Ryan had prepped me for days. They're a little formal, but they're great people. My mom can come across as intimidating, but it's just her way. Just be yourself. They'll love you. He was so anxious for me to make a good impression that it made me anxious too. Their house was less of a home and more of a monument to wealth. It was a sprawling brick mansion at the end of a long, curved driveway, surrounded by gardens that looked like they were trimmed with surgical scissors. There was a cold, imposing perfection to it all. I suddenly felt deeply insecure about my simple navy dress and the bottle of wine I'd brought as a gift. Vivian answered the door. She was tall, rail-thin, and wore an expression of faint disapproval, as if she'd been expecting someone else. Her eyes, a pale, icy blue, performed a slow, clinical scan of my entire being, from my sensible heels to my carefully applied makeup. It wasn't a greeting. It was an inspection. "You must be Nova," she said, her voice devoid of any warmth. She didn't offer a handshake or a smile. She just took in my appearance. "Ryan said you were a librarian." She said the word with a slight curl of her lip, as if it were a quaint, unfortunate hobby. Then came the line that would echo in my head for years. She tilted her head slightly and said, "Oh, you're ordinary." The word just hung there in the grand, marble-floored foyer. Ordinary. It was delivered with such casual cruelty that it took my breath away. It was an instant, brutal dismissal of me, my life, my worth. I felt my face flush with a hot, shameful blush. I looked at Ryan, my eyes pleading with him to step in, to say something, anything. He just produced a tight, nervous laugh. "Mom, come on," he chided weakly, but there was no force behind it. He was a child again, seeking her approval. "I'm merely making an observation," Vivian replied coolly, before turning her back on me and gliding away. "Thomas is in his study. Do try to keep up." Ryan gave my hand a quick, apologetic squeeze and whispered, "Don't worry about it, she's like that with everyone." But I knew that wasn't true. She wasn't like that with her son. Tom, his father, was an older, grimmer version of Ryan. He sat behind a desk that was larger than my first car, in a room that smelled of old leather and money. The books lining the walls looked like props. Their spines were perfectly straight, without a single crack to suggest one had ever been read. He shook my hand with a brief, crushing grip, his eyes already looking past me toward his son. He asked me a series of perfunctory questions that felt more like an interrogation. "Where did you go to school? What do your parents do?" Each of my answers, a state university, a small bookstore, seemed to deepen the scowl on his face. He was not interested in getting to know me. He was assessing my pedigree and finding it wanting. After 2 minutes, he turned his back on me completely and started talking to Ryan about stock prices. I was left standing awkwardly in the middle of the room, feeling like an unwanted intruder. Then Lindsay, Ryan's younger sister, made her entrance. She sauntered into the study, already holding a glass of wine, her eyes narrowed with a look of bored disdain. She gave me the same head-to-toe scan her mother had. "So you're the one," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "I was wondering what you'd be like." She took a slow sip of her wine, her eyes never leaving mine. "You don't really fit in with us, do you?" That was it. That was my welcome. Not a single person in that family had shown me a shred of warmth or kindness. It was a coordinated, tactical strike of social exclusion. Dinner was an agonizing 2-hour performance. I sat at their enormous dining table, which was set with so much silverware I didn't know where to begin. The conversation flowed around me, but never to me. They talked about people I didn't know, places I'd never been, and events that were far outside my financial reality. A charity gala, a yachting trip, a new piece of art Vivian had acquired. My attempts to join the conversation were met with polite, icy silence. I mentioned a documentary I'd recently enjoyed, and Vivian simply stared at me blankly before turning to Tom to ask about their summer plans in the Hamptons. It was a masterful, brutal shutting down. I felt like I was sitting behind a glass wall, able to see and hear everything but completely unable to connect. I ate my food in small, silent bites, concentrating on not making a sound, on not taking up space. Ryan, seated beside me, was a stranger. He was animated, laughing at his father's dry jokes, eagerly agreeing with his mother's opinions, engaging in witty banter with his sister. He was one of them. He never once tried to pull me into the conversation. He never once looked at me to see if I was okay. He had crossed over to their side, leaving me completely alone. The car ride home was thick with a heavy, suffocating silence. I waited for him to say something, to apologize for his family's behavior. He said nothing. He just turned on the radio. Finally, unable to bear it, I spoke. "They hate me," I said, my voice small and shaky. He sighed, a long, weary sound. "Don't be so dramatic, Nova. They don't hate you. Your mother called me ordinary. Your sister said I don't fit in. Your father didn't speak a single word to me through the entire dinner. How is that not hate? That's just how they are," he said, using the same tired excuse. "They're very reserved. It's not personal." "Not personal?" I could hear my voice rising, filled with disbelief. "Ryan, it was all personal. Every word, every look. They were deliberately making me feel like an outsider. And you just sat there and let them." His hands tightened on the steering wheel. "What was I supposed to do? Start a fight at the dinner table? You're being too sensitive. You just need to give them a chance." And that was the moment I understood. He wasn't going to defend me. He wasn't going to protect me. He was going to manage me. My feelings were an inconvenience, a problem to be smoothed over. His family's cruelty was a fact of life to be endured, and my reaction to it was the actual problem. That night, I lay in bed next to him, staring at the ceiling, feeling a cold dread seep into my bones. I had said yes to marrying this man. I had said yes to a lifetime of this. For the next 6 years, I tried to disappear. Not in a literal sense, of course, but I slowly and systematically erased the parts of myself that his family found so ordinary and offensive. I learned to smile when I was being insulted, to stay quiet when I had an opinion, and to make myself useful in the background. I became a ghost in my own marriage, haunting the edges of his family gatherings, and Ryan was the one who kept handing them the white sheets to throw over my head. The holidays were the worst. They became annual rituals of humiliation. Take our third Christmas as a married couple. I had decided that year that the best way to win them over was through effort. I spent a full 2 weeks in my spare time hand-knitting a beautiful cashmere blend scarf for Vivian in a soft dove gray color I knew she liked. For Tom, I found a rare, leather-bound biography of Winston Churchill, a figure he admired. I baked 6 different kinds of cookies from scratch, arranging them beautifully in festive tins for the family to share. I showed up at their house on Christmas Eve, arms laden with gifts and offerings, my heart full of a pathetic, stubborn hope. The evening was a blur of their traditions, none of which involved me. They opened gifts in a specific order, oldest to youngest. I was, of course, not included in this lineage. I was an add-on, an afterthought. When it was finally time for the informal gift exchange, I proudly handed my presents to Vivian and Tom. Vivian took the box, unwrapped a corner of the paper, and peered inside. "Oh, you knitted this?" she said, her voice laced with a faint surprise that sounded more like pity. "How quaint." She placed the box on a nearby table, where it sat for the rest of the night, a monument to my failed effort. Tom unwrapped the book, grunted, already read it, and placed it next to her scarf. Later, while I was in the kitchen quietly washing dishes that no one else had offered to help with, I overheard Lindsay talking to her mother in the hallway. "Can you believe she actually knitted something? How embarrassing. It's like something a farmer's wife would do," Vivian replied with a low, dismissive laugh. The sound of it, sharp and cruel, cut me deeper than any insult. I stood there, my hands submerged in greasy water, and just let the tears fall silently down my face. When I confronted Ryan about it on the drive home, his response was the same as it always was. "They didn't mean it like that," he said, his eyes glued to the road. "Mom thinks knitting is sweet. Lindsay was probably just joking." "I heard them, Ryan," I said, my voice thick with tears. "They were laughing at me," he sighed, that familiar sound of weary impatience. "Nova, please don't ruin Christmas. Can't we just have one peaceful night? You read too much into everything. You have to learn to let things go. He wasn't asking me to let things go. He was asking me to accept my place. My place was in the kitchen. My place was to be the butt of the joke. My place was to absorb their cruelty so he could have a peaceful night. It wasn't just the holidays. It was every birthday, every Sunday dinner, every casual get-together. My existence was systematically ignored. They would talk over me. They would ask Ryan a question, and if I started to answer, Vivian would cut me off and say, "No, dear, I was asking Ryan." My career, my thoughts, my very being were irrelevant. I once won a prestigious statewide award for a literacy program I developed at the library. I was so proud. When I told them the news over dinner, there was a beat of silence before Tom cleared his throat and asked Ryan about his golf handicap. That was it. My achievement was worth less than a golf score. I cooked, I cleaned, I served. I would arrive at family barbecues and spend the entire time shuttling food from the kitchen to the patio, refilling drinks, and clearing away empty plates. I did it because I hoped that my utility would at least earn me some measure of respect. It didn't. It just solidified my role as the unpaid help. Vivian would hand me a trash bag at the end of the night and say, "Be a dear and take this out on your way," without so much as a thank you. Ryan saw it all. He saw me fetching his father a beer while he sat and chatted. He saw me clearing plates while his sister scrolled through her phone. He saw it and he allowed it because it made his life easier. My slow erosion was a small price to pay for his family's comfort. The man I had married, the one I thought was my partner and protector, was complicit in my disappearance. He was the gatekeeper, and he never once chose to let me in. He just stood by and watched as I became more and more invisible, until I started to wonder if I was even there at all. After 5 years of being treated like a piece of furniture, a flicker of insane hope ignited in me. It happened last summer, and its death was so brutal and complete that it finally burned away any last trace of the naive woman I once was. The family lake cabin was the stuff of legend. It was their sacred ground, the setting for every cherished childhood story Ryan ever told. It was the one place I had never ever been invited. It was for family, and the unspoken message was always clear. I was not family. So when Ryan came home one Tuesday and casually announced, "Hey, Mom wants the whole family to go up to the cabin for the long weekend next month," I was stunned into silence. "The whole family?" I clarified, my voice barely a squeak. "She means me too?" "Yeah, that's what she said," he replied, already distracted by the mail. "It'll be good for you to finally see the place." I wanted to believe it. Oh, how I wanted to believe it. This felt different. This wasn't a mandatory holiday dinner. This was an invitation into their inner sanctum. For weeks, I lived on the high of this tiny offering. I thought, this is it. This is the turning point. Maybe Vivian had finally decided to accept me. Maybe Ryan had finally said something to them. The hope was so intoxicating that it blinded me to the reality I knew all too well. I prepared for that trip like it was the most important event of my life. I wanted to be the perfect guest, to prove Lindsay wrong, to show them I could fit in. I bought a new, modest swimsuit. I packed books and board games. I spent a whole afternoon baking Ryan's favorite lemon bars and my signature chocolate chip cookies, packing them carefully in tins. I imagined us sitting on the dock eating cookies, the sun on our faces. I imagined laughing around a bonfire, feeling for the first time like I belonged. The morning we were set to leave was bright and sunny. The plan was to meet at their house at 9 a.m. sharp to load up their big SUV and drive up together. I was so nervous and excited I could barely drink my coffee. I double-checked my bags. I made sure I had the cookies and a bottle of wine for Vivian. I was ready. When we arrived at their house, the scene was one of controlled chaos. Tom was strapping a canoe to the roof rack. Lindsay was arguing with Vivian about which bag she was allowed to bring. Ryan immediately went to help his dad, leaving me standing awkwardly on the driveway. Vivian spotted me and gave me a brittle smile. "Nova, darling," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Before we go, could you possibly do me a huge favor? I forgot to lock the upstairs windows, and I'm terrified a bird will get in while we're away. Could you just run up and check them all for me? You'd be a lifesaver." It was a menial task, but I was so eager to please, so desperate for her approval, that I jumped at the chance. "Of course, Vivian. No problem at all," I chirped, and practically ran inside. I felt a sense of purpose. I was helping. I was part of the team. The house was large and I was thorough. I went into every guest room, every bathroom, checking each latch, making sure they were secure. I took my time, wanting to do the job perfectly. When I was finally done, probably 15 minutes later, I came back down the stairs, a proud smile on my face, ready to announce that the house was secure, but the entryway was silent. My smile faltered. My bags, which I had left by the door, were still there. A cold, sick feeling started to creep up my spine. I walked to the front door and pulled it open. The driveway was empty. The SUV was gone. The noise, the people, the chaos, it was all gone. They were all gone. For a moment, my mind refused to process it. I thought maybe they had just pulled the car around back. I walked around the entire house. Nothing. Just the perfectly manicured lawn and the crushing silence. I pulled out my phone. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial Ryan's number. It rang and rang before finally going to voicemail. I tried again. Voicemail. Panic began to claw at my throat. I called a third, fourth, fifth time. Finally he answered, "Hello?" His voice was faint, breaking up. "Ryan! Ryan, where are you?" I cried, my voice cracking. "I came outside and you were gone. Did you forget me?" There was a long pause. I could hear the rumble of the highway and, faintly in the background, Lindsay's laugh. They hadn't forgotten me. They were laughing. Nova," he said, and his voice was thick with a weak, pathetic guilt that I knew so well. "Yeah, look, we had to get a move on. The traffic gets really bad on the holiday weekend." "The traffic?" I repeated, my voice rising with disbelief. "You left me. You left me at your parents' house, Ryan. My bags are here. You told me to check the windows." The truth landed on me with the force of a physical blow. The windows. It was a trick. A distraction to get me out of the way so they could leave without a scene. Another long, agonizing silence on his end of the line. And then he delivered the final fatal wound. "Look," he said, his voice dropping to a mumble. "Mom, she decided she just wanted it to be family this weekend." Just family. The phone slipped from my hand and clattered onto the stone steps. I didn't even register it. All I could hear were those two words echoing in the silent, empty space around me. I was his wife. I had shared his bed, his home, his life for 6 years. And I was not family. My husband had just driven away, leaving me stranded to appease his mother. I sank onto the steps, wrapping my arms around myself as a deep, shuddering sob escaped my lips. The sun was shining. The birds were chirping. It was a beautiful summer day. And I was completely, utterly, and finally broken. The hope I had clung to for so long was gone, incinerated in the fire of that one ultimate betrayal. He hadn't just allowed them to hurt me. He had driven the getaway car, but that wasn't even the worst of it. The worst was yet to come. The month after the cabin betrayal was August. The air was thick and heavy with a heat that felt like it was pressing down on the world, suffocating it. I felt the same way, weighed down, breathless. The vibrant, painful hurt from that day had cooled into something hard and dense in my chest, like a river stone. I moved through my days, went to work, paid the bills, and spoke to my husband in polite, hollow sentences. The love I'd had for him was gone. I knew it with a certainty that was as calm and absolute as the sky. All that was left was a grim sense of curiosity. I was no longer a participant in my own life. I was a spectator, waiting to see what the final act would be. The summons came on a Wednesday. Ryan stood in the kitchen doorway, looking like a child about to confess to breaking a window. "So, Mom is having the annual August family lunch on Sunday," he said, not meeting my eyes. "She's expecting us to be there." I didn't say anything. I just continued to wipe down the clean counter. "I know things have been tense," he stammered. "But if we don't go, it'll just make everything worse. Please, Nova, just for me. Let's just go and keep the peace. Keep the peace." The phrase was so absurd it was almost funny. What peace were we keeping? The cold, silent war that our marriage had become? The suffocating, one-sided truce where I was the only casualty? A year ago I would have argued. 6 months ago I would have cried. But now I felt nothing. The stone in my chest was too heavy for feelings. "Okay," I said, my voice flat. "I'll go." He looked relieved, so profoundly grateful that it was pathetic. He didn't see the emptiness in my eyes. He didn't understand that I wasn't agreeing for him, or for us. I was agreeing because I knew with a sudden chilling clarity that this would be the last time. I was going to see the story through to its end. Sunday arrived, another blazing hot day. When we pulled into their driveway, the scene was one of practiced leisure. Tom and Ryan's uncle Mark were sitting in plush patio chairs, drinking iced tea and talking about the stock market. Lindsay was laid out on a lounge chair in a designer bikini, sunglasses on, not a hair out of place. Vivian was directing the whole affair, of course, looking crisp and cool in a white linen dress. She greeted Ryan with a kiss on the cheek and me with a nod that was barely perceptible. "Nova, darling," she said, her voice like chimes of ice. "So glad you could make it. I'm dreadfully behind in the kitchen. Could you be a dear and give me a hand?" It wasn't a question. It was in order. Ryan gave me a look that said, "Just go along with it." I followed her into the pristine industrial-grade kitchen. For the next 3 hours, I was her servant. The work was endless and demeaning. I wasn't asked to cook, but to perform the tasks of a scullery maid. I stood at the sink and polished every single piece of her heavy, ornate silverware, 100 tiny spoons and forks, until my fingers were sore. She inspected each one when I was done. Then she had me iron the linen napkins. They were already perfectly pressed, but she insisted they needed to be freshened. I stood over a hot ironing board in the sweltering kitchen, sweat trickling down my back, creating perfect, sharp creases in 40 squares of fabric. Through the large kitchen window, I could see my husband. He had joined the men on the patio. He was laughing, sipping a beer, occasionally glancing toward the house with a flicker of guilt before turning back to the conversation. He was relaxing. He was enjoying his family lunch while his wife was inside, working like staff. My final task was to chop vegetables for a salad. Vivian placed a mountain of carrots, cucumbers, and bell peppers in front of me. "And I want them brunoised, Nova," she said, using the French term for a perfect, tiny dice. "Each piece should be no more than 1/8 of an inch. Uniformity is key." I stood there for an hour, my back aching, my hand cramping around the knife, meticulously dicing vegetables into impossibly small, perfect squares. With each rhythmic chop of the blade, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. I was no longer angry. I was simply observing, cataloging. This cold kitchen, this pointless, cruel labor, my husband's casual abandonment. It was all evidence. It was the final data I needed for a conclusion I had already reached. By the time I was finally allowed to sit down at the long, beautifully set dining table, I was physically and emotionally exhausted. My muscles ached, and my spirit felt rubbed raw, but I held my head up. I sat in my assigned seat and placed the perfectly ironed napkin in my lap. The conversation buzzed around me. Vivian was telling a story about a recent charity auction. Everyone was laughing. And then, Vivian clapped her hands together, a sharp, theatrical sound that made everyone fall silent. "Now," she said, a triumphant smile spreading across her face, for a little surprise. "I've had something very special flown in for our family today." 2 waiters, men in crisp black and white whom I hadn't seen before, emerged from the kitchen. They were carrying large silver platters. On the platters were the most beautiful steaks I had ever seen, thick cuts of beef seared to a perfect dark crust, topped with melting pats of herb butter. The smell was incredible. The waiters moved around the table, placing a steak in front of each person. One in front of Tom, one in front of Lindsay, one in front of Ryan and his aunt and his uncle. They moved with practiced efficiency around the table until every single setting had a plate, except for mine. The waiter passed my seat and continued on. I stared at the empty white space in front of me, the polished silver fork and knife lying on either side of nothing. The table fell silent as everyone looked from their full plates to my empty one. That's when Vivian delivered the line she had been waiting all day to deliver. Her voice was sweet as poison. "I had them imported from a very exclusive butcher in New York," she announced to the table. "They only had enough for a small order, so I only ordered for family." The silence that followed Vivian's announcement was a living thing. It was heavier than the humid August air, thick with the things no one was willing to say. The clinking of Tom's knife against his plate as he cut into his steak sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. Lindsay picked up her fork with a delicate, deliberate motion, a tiny, triumphant smirk on her face. She was enjoying the show. My face was on fire. A hot, prickling wave of shame washed over me, so intense it made my vision swim. It was the most public, most blatant act of cruelty they had ever orchestrated. It wasn't a subtle slight or a passive-aggressive comment. It was a declaration, performed in front of an audience. "You are nothing. You do not belong here." I looked at Ryan. I turned my whole body toward him, my chair creaking in the silence. My eyes begged him, pleaded with him. "Say something, please. Just this once, be my husband, defend me. Look at me." He didn't. He was staring at his steak with an intensity that was terrifying. He picked up his knife and fork, his knuckles white. He sawed into the meat, a sawing back-and-forth motion that was violent in its focus. He was pretending I wasn't there. He was pretending this wasn't happening. He was trying to disappear, just like he had always expected me to do. It was his Aunt Sharon who finally broke the spell. She was Tom's sister, a kind, quiet woman who had always given me a sympathetic look at these gatherings, but had never dared to interfere. She was a widow, and she depended on Vivian and Tom's good graces. But today, something in her snapped. She put her fork down and looked directly at Vivian, her brow furrowed. "Vivian," she said, her voice hesitant but clear. Didn't you order one for Nova? Vivian turned her cool gaze on Sharon. She gave a dismissive, airy wave of her hand, a gesture she used to shoo away an unpleasant thought. Oh, Sharon, don't be difficult, she said with a tight smile. As I said, it was a special order. I only ordered for family. The repetition of the word was the point. It was a hammer, and I was the nail she was driving it into. My chest tightened. I couldn't breathe. The air in the room felt thin, used up. All the slights, all the insults, all the years of being treated like a ghost coalesced into this one defining moment. The cabin betrayal had broken my heart. This was breaking my spirit. Or it was trying to. I turned back to my husband. He had a piece of steak on his fork. He was lifting it to his mouth, chewing slowly, methodically. He was eating. He was accepting the meal, and in doing so, he was accepting the terms. He was agreeing with his mother. I was not family. My voice came out as a whisper, ragged and raw. It was the smallest sound in the room, but it stopped everything. Am I family or not, Ryan? The table froze. Tom paused with his fork halfway to his mouth. Lindsay's smirk faltered. Even Vivian's perfect composure seemed to crack for a second. Everyone was looking at Ryan. Everyone was waiting for his answer. It was a simple question. A wife asking her husband for her place in the world. He had two choices. Me or them, he swallowed. The sound was unnaturally loud. He put his fork down, but he still wouldn't look at me. He stared at the wood grain of the table, as if it held the answers to the universe. A long, agonizing second passed, then another. Finally, he spoke, his voice a low, guttural mutter, directed at his plate, not at me. Don't do this, he said. Not here. Not in front of everyone. And there it was, the final betrayal. It wasn't his mother's cruelty that was the problem. It was my reaction to it. My pain was the embarrassment. My public humiliation was an inconvenience to his meal. He wasn't ashamed of them. He was ashamed of me. Something inside me, something that had been holding on for 6 long years, finally snapped. The hot flush of shame was replaced by an astonishing, absolute calm. It was the calm of a deep, cold lake, the calm of a decision that has finally been made. The part of me that had loved him, the part that had hoped, the part that had been willing to shrink herself to nothing to keep his love, it all died in that moment. It was a quiet, painless death, and in its place, something new and hard and clear began to rise. I looked at my husband, this weak, pathetic stranger who put his mother's twisted games above his wife's dignity, and I felt nothing. No love, no hate, just a vast, empty pity. He had made his choice, and now I was going to make mine. I took a slow, deep breath. Under the table, my hands had been clenched into tight, trembling fists. I deliberately uncurled them, finger by finger, and rested my palms flat against my legs. The shaking stopped. A strange, icy clarity washed over me. Ryan's words, "Don't do this. Not here," echoed in my mind, but they no longer had the power to hurt me. They were just words from a stranger. The stage was set. The audience was captive. He was wrong. This was exactly the place. My voice, when I spoke, was not the whisper it had been moments before. It was calm, steady, and loud enough for everyone at the table to hear clearly. "No, Ryan," I said, looking directly at him. His eyes finally flickered up to meet mine, and I saw fear in them. "This is exactly the place. And this is exactly the time." I turned my head slightly and looked at my mother-in-law. "For 6 years," I began, my tone conversational, as if I were discussing the weather. "I have tried to be a part of this family. I have cooked, I have cleaned, I have smiled, and I have held my tongue. I have accepted my place as the family ghost, the unpaid help, the convenient target." Vivian's face tightened. "Now see here," she started, but I cut her off, not by raising my voice, but by simply continuing to speak, my gaze unwavering. "Let's take a little trip down memory lane, shall we?" "Vivian," I said, my eyes locking with hers. "Remember my first Christmas with you? I spent weeks knitting a scarf for you. You called it quaint and left it on a side table, unopened for the entire night. It was a message and I received it. My efforts are worthless." Her mouth opened, then closed. For the first time, she seemed at a loss for words. I shifted my gaze to my father-in-law. "Tom," I said. He looked startled to be addressed directly. "Last year, I received the State Librarian's Award for a literacy program I created. A program that has helped hundreds of underprivileged children learn to read. I was so proud. When I shared my news at your dinner table, you didn't even say congratulations. You asked Ryan about his golf score. Message received. My accomplishments are meaningless." Tom had the decency to look away, a faint flush creeping up his neck. I turned to Lindsay. Her smug expression had been replaced by one of open-mouthed shock. "Lindsay, just last month you and your family invited me to the lake cabin. You gave me a task to get me out of the way, and then you drove off, leaving me stranded on the doorstep. I later heard you on the phone laughing about it. Message received. I am a joke. My presence is an inconvenience to be disposed of. The silence in the room was now absolute. The only sound was my own steady breathing. Finally, I turned all of my attention back to my husband. The fear in his eyes had turned to panic. He was shrinking in his chair. "And you, Ryan," I said, my voice softening into something sharp with pity. "Every single time I came to you with my hurt, and you told me I was being too sensitive. I came to you with my humiliation. And you told me not to take it personally. You asked me to absorb their cruelty so you could keep the peace. You stood by and watched them erase me, piece by piece, because you are a coward. You are so terrified of their disapproval that you would sacrifice your own wife on the altar of their comfort." I let that hang in the air for a moment. I could feel Aunt Sharon staring at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of horror and awe. I had their complete, undivided attention, but the quiet sacrifices go both ways, don't they? I continued, my voice dropping a little, drawing them in. "You see, this perfect family, this image of wealth and success you all work so hard to maintain, it's a lie. It's a house of cards, and I'm about to pull one out." I looked around the table, from Vivian's pale face to Tom's stunned one. "You all think your son, your perfect son Ryan, is a successful player in the world of finance. You praise him, you coddle him, you buy him Rolex watches to celebrate a success that doesn't exist." Ryan's face had gone ashen. "Nova, stop," he pleaded, his voice a choked whisper. "No," I said firmly. "I'm done being silent." I looked back at Vivian and Tom. "Your son, the brilliant financial mind, was fired from his job 6 months ago. Fired for gross incompetence and losing a major client a fortune. He was too ashamed, too terrified to tell his perfect parents that he was a failure. So he's been pretending to go to work every single day." A collective gasp went around the table. Vivian's hand flew to her chest. Tom looked like he had been physically struck. "And you might be wondering," I said, letting my words fall like stones into the silent pool of their shock. "How has he been paying his mortgage? His car payments? The dues for the country club? He hasn't." I paused, letting them connect the dots. "I have," I said, my voice clear and ringing in the quiet room. "For the last 6 months, I have paid every single one of his bills. My ordinary librarian's salary has been funding the illusion of your son's success. I have been paying for the gasoline in the car he drives, the roof over his head, and the food he eats. So you see, Vivian, when you served this meal, you didn't just deny me a steak. You denied a meal to the person who is single-handedly keeping your precious son from complete and utter ruin." The aftermath of my revelation was a deafening silence, a vacuum where all the air, all the arrogance, had been sucked out of the room. Vivian's face was a mask of disbelief, her perfect composure shattered. Tom was staring at Ryan with an expression of such profound disappointment, it was almost painful to watch. Lindsay looked back and forth between them all, her mind clearly struggling to process the new reality. And Ryan just sat there, utterly broken, his head bowed, staring at the hands in his lap. The puppet strings had been cut. I moved with a slow, deliberate calm. I reached down for my purse, which I had set on the floor beside my chair. There was no rush. I was in complete control. I opened the clasp and took out a simple, plain manila folder. It was thin, holding only a few sheets of paper, but it felt as heavy as a gravestone. I placed the folder on the table. The sound it made was a soft, definitive thud. With one finger, I slid it across the polished mahogany surface. It glided smoothly, silently, over the wood, until it stopped directly in front of Ryan's plate, next to the steak he could no longer eat. He stared at the folder as if it were a venomous snake. "What is that?" Vivian finally hissed, her voice a ragged whisper. I didn't look at her. I kept my eyes on my husband. "My lawyer drew them up last month," I said, my voice even and devoid of emotion. "Right after the cabin trip. Those are draft separation papers, Ryan. All they need is your signature." "I've already signed my part." Ryan finally looked up at me, his eyes wide and swimming with a pathetic, desperate plea. It was the look of a man who knew the game was over, that he had no moves left to make. The first person to recover was Vivian. Her shock morphed into a pure, undiluted rage. Her face, which a moment ago had been pale, was now mottled with angry red patches. You conniving, ungrateful little snake!" she spat, her voice shaking with fury. She stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "How dare you? How dare you air our family's dirty laundry and then try to leave him? You are not my daughter-in-law anymore." Before I could even respond, Aunt Sharon's voice cut through Vivian's tirade. "Oh, be quiet, Vivian," she said, her voice trembling but firm. She too stood up, her face etched with a deep, sorrowful shame. "For once in your life, just be quiet and listen to the truth." She turned to me, her eyes full of tears. "She's not the snake, Vivian. We are, this whole family is. She came into this house 6 years ago, a kind, decent person. And what did we do?" "What did you do?" "You belittled her. You insulted her. You treated her like she was dirt under your shoe. She tried so hard for so long to be one of us, and you never gave her a chance. Not once." She looked at her brother, Tom. "And you're just as bad letting her do it." Then she looked at Lindsay. "And you, with your pathetic, cruel little jokes." Finally, she looked at Ryan. "But you," she said, her voice breaking, "you are the worst of all. You had a good woman who loved you, and you let your mother destroy her. And you did nothing. Nothing." She looked back at Vivian, her expression one of utter condemnation. "She was never your daughter-in-law, Vivian. You never allowed her to be. She was the only one in this entire family who had any grace, and you were too blind and too arrogant to see it. You should be ashamed of yourself." Aunt Sharon sat back down, spent and trembling. No one spoke. Her words, the simple, undeniable truth, had silenced them all. I stood up. I picked up my purse. I felt a strange lightness, as if a physical weight had been lifted from my shoulders. I looked at Ryan one last time. He was still staring at the folder, a single tear tracing a path down his cheek. I felt no satisfaction. I felt no anger. I felt nothing but a quiet, sad finality. "You had 6 years to treat me like family, Ryan," I said softly, my voice carrying in the silent room. 6 years to say one word, to stand up for me just once. You chose silence. I let the words settle, the final, simple truth of our marriage. I hope it keeps you company. And with that, I turned around. I walked away from the table, away from the uneaten steaks, away from the shattered family, away from the weak man I had once loved. My footsteps echoed on the marble floor of the foyer. I did not look back. I pulled open the heavy front door, stepped out into the bright afternoon sun, and closed it gently behind me, shutting out the silence that had been my prison for so long. The divorce was surprisingly fast. Ryan didn't fight it. He signed the papers without a word. The house sold quickly. I took my half of the money, my books, my cat, and nothing else. I didn't want any reminders. 2 weeks after I walked out of that dining room, the promotion I had been working toward at the library came through. It was a director position, but at a larger branch in a city 2 states away. I accepted it without hesitation. It felt like the universe was finally pointing me toward the door I was meant to walk through. I moved at the end of September. My new apartment was small, but it had a big window in the living room that let in the morning light. I painted the walls a soft, hopeful green. I filled the bookshelves. I sat in the quiet, and it was a different kind of quiet than I had ever known. It wasn't the heavy, oppressive silence of Ryan's family home. It was a peaceful silence. It was the sound of my own life, undisturbed. One evening, about a month after I had moved, my phone rang. It was an unknown number, but I answered it anyway. "Nova?" It was Ryan. His voice was thin, hesitant. I hadn't heard it since that day. "Hello, Ryan," I said, my voice calm. I just wanted to call," he stammered. "I know it's late. I'm sorry. For everything. I was weak. I was a coward. My mom, she doesn't speak to me anymore. My dad looks at me with nothing. You were right about everything." He sounded pathetic, full of whispered regrets that came 6 years too late. I listened, and I felt a distant sort of pity for him, the way you might feel for a character in a sad book. But the story was over. I had already turned the last page. "I'm not angry anymore, Ryan," I told him softly, and I was surprised to find that it was true. The stone in my chest was gone. I just don't belong to that life anymore. I have to go. I hung up before he could say another word. I stood by my big window, looking out at the lights of a city that was all mine. I breathed in the quiet, and for the first time in years, the silence felt like home. If you've ever been treated like an outsider in your own marriage, comment below with your story. Hit like if you believe silence can be more powerful than shouting, and subscribe for more stories of betrayal, dignity, and quiet revenge.